Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer tier list. This time around we are going to be focusing on the forces of the dreaded Greenskins. And this is a faction that as of late has been a domineering force in the multiplayer scene. Definitely a top tier faction, arguably the tippy top tier faction at the moment, with several kind of difficult to deal with mechanics and some very powerful unit synergies. They do, however, have, I don't know if I'd call it a downside, but definitely one of the prominent features on the roster is a lot of redundancy. Many Greenskin units overlap in function, and as a result, I think there is going to be a decent amount of units here that may fall lower than expected, simply due to the fact that other units perform the same task just a smidge better. However, we are going to dive right in here and kick things off with the biggest, the baddest, the greenest, the meanest, Grimgor Ironhide. And unfortunately, Grimgor, not a great lord, and it's not really because he's actually bad. As a standalone sort of blob around me and I'll crump all that gets in front of me lord, Grimgor's not bad. He's got some solid dueling kit. He's got additional ward saves and melee defense when near enemy characters. He's capable of snaring and debuffing enemy characters. He's got Bloodforged armor to get out of sticky situations, and he has some monstrous sustained combat stats. However, he doesn't bring much in the way of utility, and this is definitely something that hamstrings him a good bit. He's basically just a bruiser and a brawler, but he doesn't but he's slow and he doesn't bring much to the rest of the Greenskin army. And unfortunately, that limits him a lot, especially when you've got some insane alternatives on the Greenskin roster. And unfortunately, Grimgor for me is going to land himself a low C tier. At the moment, he is the only character or only unit in C, but as this list fills up, he's going to be at the bottom, just barely out of D tier. There's very few niches, I think, where you really want Grimgor, and I'm not even sure you want him in those. Oftentimes, if you want someone to blob around, Grom, who's we're going to get to in just a little bit, is a much more potent choice just because of his language of the boys in particular, which grants some insane benefits. Moving on to Skarsnik. Skarsnik is an excellent lord choice. His one downside really, well, I should say his two downsides. He's slow, and Skarsnik's Sprotter is kind of a trash item. Those are really the two downsides. However, Spy the Bad Moon does give you some pretty bonkers bonus versus large, and allows you, and you can target that in AoE farther away from Skarsnik, so it gives you some flexibility and utility. He does, of course, have the totally fair and balanced fungal mushrooms that debuff enemy melee defense and imbue rampage, which can snare and help you snipe off enemy cavalry or key targets pretty damn efficiently. He himself is a solid combatant, is fairly cheap and survivable. So all in all, an easy A tier lord. He functions rather well in most Greenskin compositions, in my opinion, but he does get overshadowed by the next man on the list, and that is Grom the Paunch. And Grom is an easy S tier. As far as lords go, I think it speaks volumes that Grom is an S, and some of the lords that we remain to discuss were actually at one point S or A tier lords themselves. The Greenskin roster has some amazing character selection, but Grom really stands above the rest. With his Lucky Banner, he gets a massive boost to his ward save, makes him incredibly difficult to snipe when combined with his decent armor, high mobility, and regeneration. He's a very tanky lord. He can dish out decent amounts of hurt with his axe, which sunders enemy armor, and most importantly, he's got Language of the Boys, which imbues some stat buffs to melee attack and melee defense and leadership when he engages in melee in a 40 meter AoE. But more importantly, it imbues the immunity psychology. And this triggers, just from him clipping into melee, it triggers this effect for 30 seconds. So he doesn't have to stay in melee. He can clip an enemy unit, get chased off by an angry Carl Franz a split second later, and not return into melee again for another 30 seconds, and this effect will linger on all the units that were there. And it has no cooldown. It can be reset continuously. So basically, this guy can grant your entire army immunity psychology, which is insanely powerful for Greenskins. Greenskins also tend to have not the best combat stats, so the +5 melee attack and defense is an insane boost. But really, the immunity psychology is bonkers. He's the only lord character at the moment. Perhaps Grimgor will eventually get the rabble rouse that the Blackrock pre-boss gets, but at the moment, he's the only lord level character Greenskins get who grants immunity psychology. He's fairly cheap, he's survivable, he dishes out good amounts of hurt, and has insane support potential. And immunity psychology offsets really Greenskin's biggest weakness. Greenskin's leadership And to a lesser extent, their sustained combat stats are the two biggest downsides. And Grom offsets both of those while being a tanky, survivable lord, which is also something that's a premium for Greenskins. So easy S tier. Even over Skarsnik with his quote-unquote fair and balanced mushrooms, he shines well above the rest. Moving on to Azag. Azag is actually a very strong lord choice. And yet he's going to land himself a B tier. High B tier, I will say. He's still a very potent character. He's got Lore of Death. He can jump on Skullmuncher, float around at the peripheries of a fight, drop Spirit Leeches. He's fairly survivable. Jump into opportunistic battles and try to pick off enemy characters. And his items are actually very solid. Slag of Slashes, as well as his Ard Armor, granting some insane AoE buffs to armor, to melee defense, to melee attack, and offensive stats. He can be an insane buff bot, but on foot he's he's just very squishy and very inflexible. And if you put him on Skullmuncher, well, he does become a bit more flexible. You don't actually want Azag staying in sustained combat to really maximize that buffage. You often want him floating on the edges of a fight and jumping in for opportunistic picks. So while his itemization is insanely strong, it also doesn't synergize that well with his kit and with his character design. So unfortunately, he nets himself a B tier. He just gets overshadowed by the blobbery that you see with Grom especially, but also just the snares and utility of some of the other characters here. And as much the same case with Wurtzag. Wurtzag's another insanely powerful character. Flimsy, he is very, very squish, whether you put him on Spleen Ripper or on foot. He just does not have much armor. He's got physical resist, but to magic missiles especially, he's super squishy. He'll die very quickly. Doesn't have the best leadership. But the prophet of Gork and Mork is still a force to be reckoned with. He still has the Effigy of the Git, which is a very powerful snare. He still has Lore of the Bigwa, which is an excellent lore. He still has the Bonewood Staff, which is basically a mini-wah every single time you cast a spell. So he's got some insane utility, and despite that, he drops to B tier. Because he does not bring immunity psychology, he doesn't bring tankiness, and the tankiness on Lord especially is one of those sort of premiums for a character in the Greenskin roster, which both Skarsnik and especially Grom just bring more of. But he's an insanely powerful lord. Back in the day, Wurtzag would be an A or S tier easily. But right now, he just gets overshadowed so heavily. You bring him in niche compositions, or if you're feeling kind of bold and you're confident that you can protect Wurtzag, and you want to just have a slightly wider army at the expense of some lord survivability, then he can be a very strong choice. But he's definitely a less forgiving lord and a more difficult legendary lord to get work out of. Next up, the Orc Warboss. Unfortunately, yeah, sad sap. For me, he's an F tier. He's just a bad lord choice. There's no reason I can think of for bringing this guy. Grimgor isn't particularly hot, but I can think of specific niche blobs where Grimgor can shine. Whereas debuffs give him a bit. Whereas debuffs and his insane dueling potential does give him a unique niche no other Greenskin lord quite fulfills. The Orc Warboss doesn't really bring anything unique to the table. You can throw him on a Wyvern, you can throw him on a Boar, but he doesn't bring great support abilities whatsoever. He's not particularly survivable. He himself is not a great duelist. He doesn't dish out a lot of hurt, so he doesn't really do anything for you. And neither utility nor straight combat stats, nor is he particularly survivable. He's not all that cheap. He just doesn't bring anything that you couldn't get better from any other Greenskin character, and unfortunately that nets him an F. Night Goblin Warboss, however, easy A tier, right up there alongside Skarsnik. I think he's a little less good than Skarsnik, but you can throw him on he's very cheap, which is the big perk, but he also does have the boss's loons, which is a loony cast, and the loons are insanely powerful at the moment, so that's an insanely powerful item there and there. He's got Fair and Balanced Mushrooms, which is, of course, another perk, and then he has Tormentor Sword, so in case one snare isn't enough, you've got two snares on this guy. Now, he's very flimsy. He is definitely a character that can die to a stiff breeze, so you have to be wary of that. However, a very, very potent sight on the battlefield, once again, just has this insane itemization, and I think nets himself a very, very easy A tier. He's just so strong. But yeah, he's still overshadowed by Grom, and I think as we move, and then we've got the Great Goblin, Great Shaman. I'm going to put at the highest B tier here. Lore of Lilwa, solid lore. You get Vindictive Glare spam. You've got a bunch of utility spells, little buffs and debuffs. Sneaky Stabbing. You got Gork'll Fix It. Of course, you can debuff. He's got his Bound spell that debuffs enemy cooldowns and acts as a mini Spirit Leech. And you do get the Crown of Command, which nowadays when you can get your Goblin Great Shaman on a Spider, that's very useful since you can drop it on your Goblin Great Shaman to keep him in the fray when they would normally rout, or otherwise you can use it on units like Trolls to prevent them from terror routing, that sort of thing. Gives you some leadership override there, and it's very, very potent for that. So the Goblin Great Shaman, nasty piece of work to deal with. Still overshadowed, I think, by the characters above him. But honestly, an excellent character, and you can still bring him on a wolf if you want, and just have this dirt cheap mobile caster if you just want to go super wide as Greenskins. But nowadays, I feel like if you're going super wide as Greenskins, you're going to bring something to get immune psychology. So maybe this guy's no longer that great there, but still an excellent lord choice, very flexible in mount options. The Spider gives you probably the best anti-large character in the Greenskin roster, at least in isolation, because you do get, of course, the Ragnarok Spider combat stats, and Ragnarok is a beast at killing a single entity large. So, yeah, easy B tier for this guy. Very, very solid stuff. Moving on to casters, and it's quite a lineup here as well, or really moving on to heroes, I should say. Literally all of these characters are solid, some more solid than others, however. The Goblin Shaman, dirt cheap character with Little Wah, great, has poison, has stock. In my opinion, an excellent utility choice. You can just bring this guy with Vindictive Glare, and he costs like 350 gold. So you basically pay for a unit of goblins for this guy, and you get an insanely powerful character to just pressure enemy casters and lords and that sort of thing. And you throw him into melee, it might seem goofy, but you throw him in alongside, say, a unit of Black Orcs, and he applies poison in melee as long as he hits a swing every now and then. So, and he's not doing a lot of damage, but in the meantime, he is helping your Black Orcs win a fight. So, a fun little character, definitely brings a lot of utility to the field. I do believe he gets overshadowed by the Troll Hag, and we're going to get to her in just a bit, but very, very strong. Orc Shaman, I think, is definitely on the lower end of the scale right now. I'd probably put him at a C tier. He doesn't have any Winds of Magic generation items besides his Lore passive. Lore of Big Wah's kind of fallen off in favor. This guy is kind of flimsy and not the best fighter, but you're paying for combat stats on him, which is definitely a little annoying. He does get the Skull Wand of, I believe it's Karath or something. You can buff his combat stats a bit, but you don't really want to bring this guy to fight. So, kind of a pricey. His Lore isn't super. You usually want it on a primary caster. You usually bring Big Wah if you bring Wurtzag, but I feel like it's not really lore you bring a secondary caster for unless you really need Fists of Gork to fight Ethereals or something. So unfortunately, I'd probably net this guy at a C tier. Not a bad character by any stretch, but I do think as far as utility goes, he's probably on the lower end of the spectrum for Greenskin characters, for sure. Which moves us on to the Troll Hag, and I'm tempted to put her up at S tier. She's a very, very solid pick. I'm going to end up putting her at a very high A tier. You'll see her in most builds. She's got Lore of Death, of course. She has lost Assault of Stone, which is good at least. So you no longer get a Lord level item on a hero. But she still does have Mither, which is an insanely powerful snare. She still does have the Stinky Aura, which debuffs enemy melee attack by 5, which, you know, it's not bad. That's a AoE debuff. She's fairly tanky with over 4,000 HP and regen. And this isn't always that useful in melee. People think that she's a decent melee combatant. She really isn't. Her stats are terrible. She doesn't have very good leadership. She tends to rout quickly. But what it does mean is that you don't have to worry about overcasts. You can spam Overcast Spirit Leech with its 300 meter range with a relative impunity. Whereas with, say, if it's on Azag, you are risking blowing up your Lord, and he is not going to recover from that. If you do this with other factions' Deathcasters, you are risking blowing up your caster for, depending on what their armor levels might be, like 250 to 500 HP every single cast, and then have no way of recovering that. Death Hag, she'll heal back from those miscasts. It doesn't matter. And then she does have all those utility items, so easy upper A tier. You'll see her in the majority of Greenskin builds nowadays. And she's not necessarily the cheapest character, but very, very potent. Moving on to the Goblin Big Boss, and I think he is quite a powerful sight on the battlefield. Probably somewhere between low A and high B for me. Greenskin heroes are just a very, very competitive category. I'm probably going to put him at a high B or low A. For me, I don't use him that often, mostly because I like the Blackrock Big Boss, even though I think the Blackrock Big Boss is not as good as this guy. I'm going to put this guy at a high B. The Goblin Big Boss has some excellent mount choices. He's very good at being disruptive and being harassment against enemy single entities. He can pressure enemy heroes and characters and lords. He, of course, does have They Need Stabbin', which lets you single out a single character or target and nuke them down fairly quickly. And he does all of this while being a pretty darn cheap character. He doesn't cost you much. Perhaps, maybe I'll put him on the lower end, a bit beneath the lords here, because perhaps the biggest downside to this guy is just that he's competing for a very competitive character slot against a Death Hag. You're almost always going to, especially with Grom's prominence, and the fact if you look at the top 3 lord choices here, and this is what you'll most of the time see, usually you don't have a caster lord. That does mean that you need a character, you need a caster as one of your heroes. That only leaves one hero slot open, and that hero slot, in the Greenskins case, could actually be taken by a secondary caster, and it happens fairly often. But otherwise, there's also, of course, Bob, who also competes with the Big Boss, in my opinion, for a slot. But, yeah, Big Boss there. Definitely a solid character. Hunter, definitely a solid debuffer and harassment tool. Can provide some poison support, though it's less important nowadays with the fact that poison doesn't friendly fire. But a very, very solid choice there. Moving on to the Black Orc Big Boss, and I think he's going to get himself a high C. Might seem odd here. I'm sure some people are going to think, wow, he gives immunity psychology R. Why isn't he higher? Well, it mostly comes down to cost. You kind of want this guy to be a buff bot with his Brass Cleaver and with his Rabble Rouse. But at the same time, he costs a lot of money to get that. If you get this guy on full on a boar, you're looking at 1,500 plus gold. If you with decent kit on a board. On foot, he's insanely overpriced for what he brings to the table. If you compare him to, say, an Exalted Hero from Chaos, he is massively, massively, massively overpriced. This kind of limits his utility. Usually, if you want that immune psychology, you'd rather bring Grom, because Grom's a more cost-efficient way to get that immune psychology. That said, you do get AP on a board. You've got some pretty monstrous combat stats in sustained combat. Very, very solid melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength, a shield, AP on a boar, immune psychology for himself, solid leadership, immune psychology aura. +9 melee attack means that he synergizes very well with both trolls and boars, buffing their melee attack up by quite a bit. Just a very strong character in general. Gets himself an easy C tier. It's really the cost that holds this guy back. If he was a bit cheaper, and I'm not sure or saying he should be, but if he was a bit cheaper, he'd probably easily spike to a high B or even A tier. Moving on to Infantry, and this is where the Green Tide definitely has some strengths. Just some mild, tiny strengths here and there, perhaps. We do start off with Gobos. And Goblins, is anyone surprised, are S tier. You will see these guys in basically every Greenskin build, at least in some capacity. And it's not just because they're cheap and cheerful. They have silver shields. They have okay leadership. They have okay combat stats. And with WoW, those stats spike an immense amount. You get immune psychology from WoW. You get decent combat stats from WoW. And they just give you so much frontage being buffed by WoW. They will annihilate basically all enemy chaff thanks to WoW. Even more expensive chaff, they will annihilate just because they get those WoW procs. And at the same time, they soak missiles super well, unless it's like Outrider grenade launchers. And they can disrupt backlines really well. Even without WoW, they will beat any sort of equally priced chaff efficiently. So easy S tier for these guys. You'll just see them in just about every build. Night Goblins, not so good. In my book, probably a C or even D tier. I think I might actually give these guys a D. I'm going to give them a C. I think a low C here. Not very good units. Mostly because their leadership's terrible. Granted, nowadays you can offset that with Grom, with a caster, with a Blackrock Big Boss. You can offset that a little bit. But they don't have fanatics bound to them, so you can't just nuke enemy infantry. They're basically just it's like an Empire Swordsman with stock and Vanguard and poison, but with terrible leadership. So they route pretty easily, and they don't have a sort of uber gimmick the way fanatics do. Overall, unless you're doing some Vanguard shenanigans, I don't think they're a very valuable unit. I don't think you're going to see these guys very often. And generally, they're heavily overshadowed by the Regiment Renown variants and the Fanatics. Moving on to Orc Boys, I think these are a much more respectable unit, though certainly not quite as high up there as Goblins. I think a low A for them is respectable. They hit fairly hard. Once again, they've got excellent synergy with the WA, big boost to their weapon strength, big boost to their fairly low melee attack, and gives them immune psychology. Otherwise, a respectable combat unit overall. At 450 gold, they're not too expensive to field a good amount of them. And they do give you some more staying power and oomph than, say, Goblins. Especially if you're dealing with some more decently armored opponents, which Goblins can struggle with due to their low AP values. Fanatics, an easy A tier. And honestly, I'm sure some people would probably argue they're an S tier. But I'm going to give them an A because I think they're a bit unforgiving and people underestimate that still. Their low leadership means it's very easy for these guys to get run off before they get any value from the Fanatics. A Blood Roar, even if you've got immune psychology from, say, Grom, if somebody jumps in on you with a Blood Roar or runs you over with Volkmar or an enemy Chariot Lord, these guys are out very quickly. They don't stick around easily, and yeah, they just run very, very easily. So all Fanatics are broken OP, and they will annihilate an enemy front line. They do take some micro, and the unit, unlike the Regiment of Renown, which just doesn't route no matter what, this unit routes very easily. So you can, in fact, kind of beat them to the punch and run them off the field before they dish out that insane burst of hurt to your battle line. Moving on, we've got Nasty Skulkers, and these guys at one point would have probably been an A or even S tier, but with the recent proliferation of Greenskin snares and immune psychologies and blah 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 blah, but like with the fact that the Greenskins have gotten a lot more tools lately, these guys have really fallen downhill. I'm going to give them a low C here as well. I think they're better than, say, Night Goblins, but I think they've fallen off a lot in favor. I don't think it's due to lack of merit. I think it's simply that the Greenskins now have better tools for the job. Greenskins now have more forgiving playstyle. Their infantry no longer gets bowled over as easily, so your backline's easier to defend right away there. Greenskins have snares a dime a dozen on multiple other units. They've got, of course, Mither. They've got Gorkle fixed it, which they've had for a while, but now Poison doesn't apply friendly fire, that sort of stuff. So there's many more ways to snare and bog down enemy units than just Nasty Skulkers with their smoke bombs. And ultimately, Nasty Skulkers are a bit of a finesse requiring unit, and I think that limits them a bit. Still an excellent unit for backline defense. Still an excellent unit to sneak into an enemy backline and do some sneaky stabbing. Can still drag enemy heavy cavalry and monsters into the muck. One thing I will also say is if Fanatics get rebalanced, these guys might see some more use, because part of the problem lately has been that Fanatics essentially delete enemy front lines. And that results in the fact that most Greenskin infantry, which normally you'd want to just blitz through an enemy front line, kind of falls off. It's like, why would I pay to flank dwarf units with Nasty Skulkers where I might get blasting charged and get no value, when at least I could bring Night Goblin Fanatics, drop some Fanatics, and nuke a unit of miners, even if I get blasting charged in return. So it's a bit of a difference there. And I think if Fanatics get properly balanced in one of the future patches, we may in fact see Skulkers get a little bit of a resurgence again as that backline harass unit. Moving on to Savage Orcs, I don't think they're a very good unit. They're going to get themselves a D tier. At 550 gold, they're just too expensive compared to Orc Boys for the improvements they bring. They are faster than Orc Boys, which is nice, but so are Goblins, and Goblins are a lot cheaper. They're fairly good melee attack when you factor in Frenzy, of course. Under WA, means they don't actually synergize that well. WA doesn't actually synergize that well with these guys, especially for the cost. They do hit a bit harder than Orc Boys, and they can overrun a backline a little bit better. But ultimately, for 550 gold, these guys are just not worth it most of the time. You're better off just bringing Orc Boys and winning that front line normally, or Goblins, or you're better off going up a tier and bringing Savage Orc Big Guns especially, who are just way, way better than them, and just outshine them by a landslide. Which does move us on to Big Guns. Big Guns, a bit of a tough one for me. I'm not the biggest fan of this unit. I'm going to give them a B tier, low B. Decent all-around combat infantry, though lacking in shields. They do have a mild bonus versus large. fairly poor armor and fairly poor mobility, but very high HP and okay combat stats and solid weapon strength. So kind of like Saurus in a way, but without shields. Not an amazing unit, but they can give you some oomph against enemy heavy cavalry forces. They can give you some oomph against enemy large. For only 800 gold, they do beat the brakes off a lot of squishier infantry, even though they're not an anti-infantry specialist. And they net themselves a solid B, a respectable B tier. Which moves us on to Savage Orc Big Guns, which are, in my opinion, the main reason these guys get overshadowed. Savage Orc Big Guns are just big guns, but better. For 100 more gold, you get way more speed, which is nice for catching large, as well as if you blitz through a front line. These guys carve through a front line quick, which they can. You then overrun the back line very, very efficiently. Unlike Savage Orcs don't actually crush a front line that quickly. Savage Orc Big Guns can do so fairly efficiently. So another, probably the low A here. But yeah, that high speed, that high charge bonus, high weapon strength, high HP pool, just a very, very strong infantry unit, and one that I find myself running a lot. And some of it probably boils down to my play style as well. I tend to be a very aggressive, rush-oriented player, but definitely Savage Orc Big Guns, very respectable unit. Easy A for me. Easy low A here for me. Maybe I should move these units down a tier. I'd probably put these guys at like a B. Yeah, let's put these guys down to a B. And I do think they're good, but ultimately they're a little bit more niche. And I'm gonna move these guys down to like a C here-ish. I think you see these guys a little bit more than SC Skulkers. Which moves us on to Black Orcs. And the Black Orcs used to be kind of an S tier core unit for Orcs, but once again, they've fallen off. They compete quite heavily with Stone Trolls, and Stone Trolls are arguably better, especially with Grom buffs, which just overbuff them through the roof. Their ability to carve through infantry is also overshadowed by Night Goblin Fanatics, which are just broke OP. Their immune psychology, once again, they used to be the stable rock of the Greenskin roster, but that is now overshadowed by so many immune psychology auras and abilities and that sort of stuff. Other Greenskin tools have also gotten buffs in that department. Like, for example, nowadays, Savage Orc Boar Boys, Orc Boar Boys are just overpowered for their price and synergize insanely well with those immune psychology units. Black Orcs don't really get a synergy there. They get some mild stat boosts if they fight alongside Grom, but they don't get an immune. Their leadership's the same. They're just still a holding tool, but a good one. And for that, they're going to get themselves a high B tier. You will still see Black Orcs a decent amount of the time, especially in certain matchups where Stone Trolls remain somewhat unreliable, since their leadership is not good. Even if you have immune psychology, that leadership is still not very high. It's still only 40 baseline. So even with abilities and auras thrown in, you're often looking at only 50 leadership with immune psychology versus Black Orcs, who sit in the 60s with immune psychology. So it is a gap there in performance. Black Orcs, of course, also have more armor, which can matter in certain circumstances. And more models, which means they can dish out more hurt in some cases. Moving on to Regiments of Renown, the Warlords Boys, another unit you basically never see. I don't know if I'd actually put them above or below normal Night Goblins. I just don't think it's a unit you almost ever use. They're Night Goblins with immune psychology, which has once again kind of been overshadowed by all those units that give immune psychology, and armor sundering instead of poison, which is kind of cool. But as far as utility goes, it's hard to make use of armor sundering on a melee unit. You're not guaranteed to fight a unit where that's valuable. And with only 3 Regiments of Renown available for Greenskins, who have some insanely good Regiments of Renown, and you basically always max out on them, these guys really do fall by the wayside and could probably be argued to be as low as a D tier, now that I think about it. And you know what, I'm actually going to put them at D tier. I think just the fact that they are a Regiment of Renown and competing for that incredibly hotly contested spot on the Greenskin lineup does bump them down a tier. Moving on to AP Loonies, and these are an easy S. Like, this is the opposite of the Warlords Boys. Unbreakable Goblin Fanatics. That's all that needs to be said. Where Night Goblin Fanatics can at least be run off occasionally to deny them too much usage of their stupid Night Goblin Fanatic cast, these guys you'll basically never be able to deny. Unless you luck out with a Burning Head and incinerate the whole unit, they will always get a Night Goblin Fanatic cast. At least 1, usually 2, sometimes even all 3 before you really cripple this unit, depending on how conservatively your opponent plays with it. So yeah, an insane unit. You'll see them in basically every single Greenskin build. Just a staple pick. They're AP Gloonies. Consistent source of poison. Fanatics. They're insane. Crimson Killers. Another D tier. Biggest problem, once again, I would say is Fanatics. These guys are a dedicated infantry killer Black Orc variant. Nothing inherently wrong with that. However, when, as Greenskins, you already slice and dice your way through infantry with some good Fanatic casts, yeah, these guys, or wad up Black Orcs or whatever, really, but these guys just do get overshadowed quite heavily at the moment. The fact that almost nobody is going to risk bringing decent infantry against you, not even Chaos anymore because of how brutal Fanatics are, it just cripples the reason to bring Crimson Killers. Like, I remember back in the day, you'd occasionally see Chosen against Greenskins, because Chosen could, if you had some prep against artillery and you were ready to, say, deny Foots of Gork, you were ready to snipe out an enemy caster, Chosen could do well against Greenskins. Not anymore. Not with Fanatics. It's just not going to happen. Because you're not going to be able to shut all of those down even if you wanted to. And that does make the Crimson Killers pretty obsolete and shoves them down to D tier despite the buffs they've been getting consistently. And that does net them, yeah, that does net them down there. Moving on, we do have Goblin Archers. Yeah, an easy staple unit. You'll see them in almost every, well, see almost every matchup, but they have kind of fallen out of favor lately because Orc Era Boys are good and people finally realized it. I'm going to give them a low B. They're a good unit, but not that good. They have great synergy with the Rusty Airs, of course. They can apply some constant pressure, but most of the time I find Greenskins tend to spam their Skirmish Cav, which is disgustingly underpriced. Or people bring units like Orc Era Boys. You'll often see them because they do have that extra. They have 6 AP versus just 1 on Goblins, and even with the fewer models on Orc Eras, because you've only got 68 versus 90 in Goblins, it's still way more AP. You're looking at something like 4 times the AP values on Orc Era Boys that you would be looking at on a unit of Goblins. So that does hold these guys back a little bit. Still, they're very cheap and very cheerful. Night Goblin Archers, I'm going to put at a similar spot. I think basically they're just souped up Goblins who have stock and have poison, which can be useful. I don't think they're an amazing unit by any stretch of the imagination, but being able to apply some ranged poison, maybe we'll even drop them down to like a high C, just to free up some space. But definitely useful units, but I think nowadays you'll often see Orc Errors and Savage Orc Errors. The fact that you don't have to defend Orc Errors and Savage Orc Errors in a lot of matchups also helps. Personally, I'm not that fond of Orc Errors because they're a bit slow and they're more difficult to reposition, so I'll put them at top of C here. While Savage Orc Errors, and I know I'm just skipped over Fanatics, but Savage Orc Errors go up to the bottom of B here. And the reason for that is, well, once again, you're going to pick some combo here with Rusty Errors, and depending on your budgets and what exactly your build is, it's going to vary a bit, so they're all kind of competing for the same slot. But I do think the Orc versions are more popular. I think Savage Orcs are the best because they're the most mobile, so they can flex to where they're needed quickly with 37 speed. They also will countercharge and crush a unit like Hounds or even light cavalry in close quarters. Orc Errors will beat a unit of Hounds in close quarters, it just takes longer. Goblins, of course, will just die. And so it's a reason to bring Orc Errors. They essentially don't have to take care of them. They don't need a bodyguard unit unless you're fighting a faction with lots of heavy cav. And they don't, and even in that case, they're not going to rout super easily. They're going to stick around and be a pain in the rear. Especially if you get a WAF in the midst of that, then the immune psychology and whatnot will often just keep them in the fight regardless. And plus they hit like Orc Boys in melee, so they're often dishing out damage even to heavy cav in melee. And then, of course, you've got that bonus AP at long range. You've got 6 AP per model versus 1. So when all's said and done, you're looking at 400-ish AP per volley instead of 90 from Goblins. So very, very potent units here with the Orc Errors. I think their bad accuracy can potentially hold them back, but usually it doesn't matter too much. Bad accuracy is one of those fake stats in this game. The only time I found that it really matters is when you're fighting against pinpoint targets, or if you're fighting with, or if you're using guns. Guns tend to suffer more for poor accuracy than bows do. Moving on to the Fanatics. This is a unit I don't find particularly useful. I'm going to give a D tier. Fanatics, as OP as they are, it's just added micro on an archer unit that I don't really think you want to use. Technically, if you're on top of your micro, this can be a good way to delete a unit of Cav that got cheeky and got in your backline. But ultimately, I think an easier way of defending your backline is to just cough up the money for orc errors. These guys, I guess, could nuke a heavy Cav unit, unlike orc errors. But personally, I just don't think they're worth it. Even though they might seem cool, and Fanatics are overpowered. In my book, I just never see these guys. I don't see them used effectively, and I don't think they deserve more than a D. Rusty Airs, though, easy A tier. You'll see them in, I don't know, the majority, a lot of builds. Maybe not the majority, but I would say a majority of builds. Armor Sundering at range is very, very useful. Synergizes with any Greenskin missile unit, and even synergize with some of your melee units. Can make Savagery big guns and whatnot hit a bit harder, especially now that it doesn't debuff your own troops. It's nifty. But yeah, you can buff those Savage Orc errors, have them punch even harder. Buff your goblins up. It does a lot. It does a lot. Like if you're fighting a unit with 100 armor and hit it with Armor Sundering, you end up doing about double the non-AP damage you would be doing normally. And well, that might seem like not a lot, but with goblins, for example, that's an extra 2 or 3 points of damage per missile. That you end up doing. It's a big difference. It's a big game changer. Moving on to Cavalry. Wolf Riders. Not a huge fan of this unit. They're like a very cheap hound unit at 300 gold with terrible combat stats. Very cheap throwaway backline harass. Probably a C, maybe even a D tier. I really do not like this unit. I feel that Spider Riders are better generally for what these guys provide, so I'm gonna give them an upper D here. I just don't think personally they deserve higher than that. Because Spider Riders are better. Spider Riders apply poison and melee. They've got Striders, so while they're slower on paper, they're not that slower in practice a lot of the time. They've got much better combat stats, much better sustain stats. They're tankier, and they're not too much more expensive than than Goblin Wolf Riders. So Spider Riders here, just much better unit, and in my opinion, easy low A, and that's kind of your premier light cavalry for Greenskins. So you'll see these guys very, very often, even if just 1 or 2 of them to screen for skirmish cav and the likes. Whereas Wolf Riders kind of overshadowed. Squig Hoppers, solid unit that nowadays I feel gets overshadowed by Boars, because Boars have some insane synergy with Grom. Grom's roids up their stats and gives them immune psychology. Still a respectable unit though. Squigs can munch through infantry very, very quickly. They've got some decent bonus versus infantry. They've got decent AP values. They've got poison. They've got innate immune psychology. So if some of these immune psychology auras get nerfed or removed or whatever in the coming patches, they might see a bit of a resurgence. But at the moment, I think Squigs deserve no more than a C tier. Usually they just get overshadowed by other units, namely Boars. And Boars for me are hovering between a B and A tier. I'm going to give them a B, but I think they're excellent. Their armor's good for how cheap they are. Their mobility is really their one big downside. Their combat stats aren't very good, but that's true for most cav in this price range. They've got AP. They've got shields. They've got a fairly high HP pool. They've got decent armor at 65. And when you throw in someone like Grom, they really just become a force of nature. Savage Orc, Boar Boys, not so good. In my book, they might be another F tier. I really can't think of an instance where you really want them. Their benefits over Boar Boys are just way too limited for 100 extra gold. Unfortunately, I can't really think of an instance. I can think of certain niche matchups where Savage Orc, Boar Boy Big Guns have a little bit of a niche. But normal Boar Boy Big Guns just do not feel worthwhile at the moment to bring over Boar Boys who have their shields, who have some decent armor, despite the physical resist on these guys. Because they're just so flimsy. The speed benefit they have is not really very good, and while they do get some extra melee attack and charge bonus from Frenzy, it's just not really enough, I think, to offset the fact that they do cost 100 more, and they are flimsier than Boar Boys. Moving on to Savage Orc Boar Boy Big Guns. Now these guys are another excellent unit. I'm actually going to give them a low A. I don't know. I'm going to give them a high B because they're another excellent unit. They're right in there with Boar Boys. You'll often see the two working in conjunction together. On paper, not great combat stats, but great armor nowadays at 85. Really got overbuffed there, which once again, it synergizes great with Grom because these guys don't rout nowadays. Before, you could surround them and rout them with terror, but now you have Grom in there usually, or sometimes a Black Orc Big Boss, and these guys just do not flee the field. And it does leave Boar Boy Big Guns as a pretty insane unit. They'll outgrind basically every cavalry in their price point. They beat both Cold Ones, if I remember correctly, both Cold One Spear Rider variants. Though it's a bit of a 50-50 against the Lizard version. The Cold One Knights, they just simply straight up beat. They beat down, of course, they trade up really well into Knights of the Blazing Sun and Reiksguard. They trade really well into units like Silverhelms, Knights of the Realm, etc. They're a very, very strong unit. And then you throw in a character like Grom to buff them up, and they become insane because you just cannot route them in their unit that trades very efficiently to begin with. So easy B tier for them. Savage Orc Boar Boys, less good, but better than normal Savage Orc Boar Boys. Good against, for example, Bretonnia. They are definitely flimsier, but they trade actually beat, I believe, in 1v1 Questing Knights, which is a rarity. Questing Knights are an insanely underpriced unit. They're basically a 1300 gold cavalry, and they cost 1100. So the fact that these guys actually beat them, I believe, in a 1v1, well, at least the last time I tested this, they did, is pretty insane. So they do have some niche matchups. The lack of armor, though, and the lack of shields, though. Granted, Boar Boy Big Guns also don't have shields, but the lack of shields on these guys, of course, does mean leave them squishy. They don't have very much armor, so they're very flimsy to damage output, and their leadership ain't the greatest. But unlike Savage Orc Boar Boys, where I feel the only reason you'd bring them is on a themed, like Warsack themed Savage Orc army, these guys do have a bit of a niche against, say, Bretonnia, where they can dish out some major hurt. Moving on to Cavalry Regiments of Renown, the Moonhowlers are an alright unit, though I think they've kind of gotten overshadowed lately. Back in the day, Greenskins didn't tend to have fear in their armies. At most, you'd have like a single spider. Nowadays, with the prevalence of trolls, and specifically stone trolls, of course, as a pick, with the prevalence of units like the Hag, there's actually a decent amount of fear running around on the field for Greenskins, which in turn kind of undermines the Moonhowlers' gimmick, which is that they cause fear. That said, they are an all-right Regiment of Renown. They can do some decent work against backlines if you get in there, but I still don't think they're worth it compared to, say, Spider Riders. Jerkit Squigs are basically Squigs, but better. I think if you're going to bring Squig Hoppers at all, you will probably bring this unit, but unfortunately, Squig Hoppers as a whole have currently just kind of fallen off in the meta compared to Boar Boys. So I will move these guys up a little bit on the roster. If you're going to bring any Squigs, these guys are going to be it. But I think no higher than like a mid-C tier for these guys. They're just not that good. Broken Tusk Mob is a bit of an oddball. Very, very powerful armor for a Greenskin cavalry unit, sitting at 110 off the top of my head. So very, very beefy. They do also get Encourage, but that Encourage kind of undermined by the fact that you'll usually bring a Black Orc Big Boss or Grom, once again, with your cavalry mob. Still a decent unit, but I think that for the cost, they're just a little too expensive compared to Boar Boy Big Guns to bring these guys consistently. And so they're also going to net themselves a mid-C tier. Just think they get overshadowed by how much more efficient for the cost something like normal Boar Boys or Big Guns are. Moving on to Greenskin Missile Cav, and this is where Greenskins definitely shine, or can shine. Wolf Rider Archers, excellent unit, easy A tier, in my opinion, and Spider Rider Archers, easy S tier, and honestly, both of these could probably be argued to be S tier. I think the poison on the Spider Riders pushes them up a tiny bit more over top of the Wolf Riders, but both units essentially benefit from being so cheap that nobody can afford, really, to waste time and units chasing them, but that in turn means they're guaranteed to get all their ammo off. And while that might not seem that terrible, their damage output isn't that insane per model and all that. It adds up over the course of a long game. And it means that these units are basically guaranteed to get multiple times their value over the course of an average match, simply because your opponent cannot shut them down cost effectively. The only factions that can kind of pull it off is like Empire, maybe, with grenade launchers if they get a jump on you. But both of these units are very, very difficult to shut down efficiently. And while not doing amazing damage, they do dish out an okay amount of damage, and in the Spider's case, poison. That cannot be said for Goblin Wolf Chariots, which are kind of potato tier. I'm going to give them a D. I don't even think... Honestly, these guys might be an F tier unit, and I'm just being too generous here. Maybe they are. Maybe they really should be F tier. They are a bit tankier, but Chariots recently have gotten nerfed by proxy with all the knockback changes, and that's undermined one of the main uses for these guys as a cheap disrupt. And their arrow damage really isn't very good. So you pay more than you would for other Greenskin missiles for survivability, I suppose, but that survivability just isn't worth it, especially going other Greenskin missiles just get ignored anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. Marauders and Marauders, an excellent cavalry unit and an A tier as well. However, I actually think these guys are better balanced, even though very popular because they're an AP. They're just Wolf Riders with immune psychology and an inverse of AP and non-AP. So these guys do 10 AP damage, 1 non-AP per shot. These guys are actually better balanced because at 600 gold it's actually worth it to shoot these guys and to get rid of them. It's actually cost effective to do so, and I think that actually results in a more balanced unit and a unit that isn't as busted. That said, they are a very powerful unit. It's 360 firing AP missile cav, so very, very solid. Can dish out a lot of hurt given the time to do so, and that's itself an easy A tier here. The Spider Rider Regiment of Renown, the Deaf Creepers, I think also get themselves an S tier. Getting regen and stock is very, very nifty. Lets them position for some good harass. Makes them even more difficult and annoying to shut down. And means they keep coming back to be a pain in the rear. And also, well, usually like that cheap poke you might use to zone these guys away just doesn't work. Because regen just means they bounce right back and are back in your lines being a pain in the rear. Tifrabas, kind of a meme. Wolf Chariots with Vanguard, only a smidge more expensive, but their stats are the same garbage. So yeah, F tier for them as well. I just don't see much of a reason at the moment to use these guys. I don't think there is any reason to really use them, unfortunately. I hate to say it. Moving on to the pump wagons and chariot category as a whole here. I think these units all... Now, granted, Chariots got nerfs in this past patch, or these past patches, with the advent of knockback changes. However, Chariots also got proxy nerfed on the Greenskin roster specifically with the fact that Fanatics are broke OP. And with Fanatics being broke OP, there's essentially zero reason to use Chariots to wipe Infantry. You almost never face decent Infantry to begin with, and when you do, a single cast of Fanatics puts an end to that nonsense. So, undermines these units a lot. I don't really think there's much of a purpose to bring any of these Chariots at the moment, even though they can be cheap harass and they can be cheap disrupt and they can provide you with some utility with armor sunder, and on paper that looks great. But really, I'm going to give all these units a D tier. I like Flappas a bit better than the others, so I'm going to shift them up a bit higher in D tier, but I think ultimately all these units, at least all the pump wagons, are just heavily overshadowed at the moment. They're very flimsy, so they get torn apart in melee easily, and they just are very easy to... while they're AP Chariots, they're just overshadowed horribly. The Spore Splotas might be a bit better as well, though they're so expensive that relative to normal pump wagons that it kind of undermines them. Board Chariots I think are pretty terrible. I think they're an F tier. You don't really bring them at all. It's not even simply the fact that they're overshadowed. They're also just a bad unit, and they've been a bad unit for ages. I don't know if there was ever a point when board Chariots were considered good, but at the moment they're definitely pretty trash. Moving us on to monsters, and that's quite a broad category, though a lot of not so great units in here, as well as some great ones, I guess. Squigs, not a great unit. In my opinion, probably a D tier. I'm going to give them a lower D here, maybe like around there. Cheap throwaway unit, but not that cheap because they cost 500 gold. You send them hurling into enemy infantry lines and they die, but hopefully they do some damage. Once again, kind of overshadowed by Fanatics, who, if you're going to have a one-shot wonder, it's better to have goblins with a dirt cheap wind spell than a bunch of rampaging monstrosities, which potentially take a shot from some crossbows and rampage into a unit of slayers, and that's it for you. I do think the unit could use some very mild buffs, perhaps, to something like leadership or whatever, but honestly, by and large, the unit just not very good and overshadowed quite heavily at the moment by Fanatics again. And that's a common theme here, but I think it is just important to recognize that right now Fanatics are so strong on the Greenskin roster They're one of the there's a handful of super strong gimmicks right now for Greenskins. It's not like the entire faction head to toe is broke OP. But this handful of very, very powerful units essentially obsoletes much of the roster or leaves them undesirable. Moving on to Trolls, not a great unit despite the prevalence of immune psychology. You do occasionally see them. I'm going to give them a low C here because they are cheaper than Stone Trolls. So if you're not expecting too much missile pressure, the fact that they do cost 300 less than Stone Trolls is definitely a benefit. And you can still immunity psychology and leadership buff them and all that with Grom or whatever. So very potent unit in that sense. However, very flimsy to missile pressure, and that leaves them undesirable compared to, say, Stone Trolls. And definitely not a staple unit for Greenskins, I would say. But something that you see more commonly than these D tier, much less F2 units. Swamp Trolls or River Trolls, not very good at all. Another, honestly, F-tier unit, unfortunately. They're basically Trolls with a slight stat redistribution. They've got more melee defense, less melee attack, less weapon strength. But they also get a small AoE aura, the Stench from the Hag, -5 melee attack. The problem is usually you have a Hag to apply that debuff. And otherwise, it's just Trolls that you're paying an extra 100 for to get aquatic and swap some stats around. So the unit's kind of overpriced for what it does. It doesn't have anything unique that it really brings to the table for the Greenskin roster. And unfortunately, you're just never going to find a reason to use these guys for 100 price hike over Trolls. They're unfortunately not really, there's not really a reasonable purpose for them. Stone Trolls, however, are an excellent unit. And they are a very easy A tier. I'm not sure where I would position them on A tier. Maybe like around here. You see them a lot. They're decent armor, excellent resistance to missiles and magic, and of course the combination of those two makes them very, very resilient to just about everything thrown at them. They also have higher weapon strength than normal Trolls, so they hit even harder. Throw in the Grom for the immunity psychology, and they are an unstoppable juggernaut. They will really rend just about anything, whether cavalry or infantry or single entities, limb from limb. They just do so much damage, and can stick around really well when you've got these support characters that enable it. So easy A tier for these guys. You'll see them in a massive amount of builds. They're not as domineering as they were a couple patches ago. Part of the reason, I think, is because they did get some very mild nerfs that missile resist, but by and large, excellent unit, easy A. Giants, as we probably could figure, not an A. D tier at best, in my opinion. They do hit pretty hard, of course. They do have their niches against units factions without heavy missile presence, because they can swat down vampire count flyers, for example, pretty well. Their massive HP pools means that if you're dealing with a lot of AP melee, for example, they're pretty tanky for how cheap they are. They only cost 1,500. They do cost fear. They do cost terror. 100 leadership means they're borderline unbreakable. Very, very powerful unit in their own right, but not something you're going to see in most matchups. Arachnarok Spider definitely took a hit in its popularity with the past patches. Part of that is because you can now get an Arachnarok Spider in with the Shaman. Part of it is that there's new tools for Greenskins to crump large. Part of it is that the Arachnarok Queen, as always, overshadows the Spooter. So Spider, for me, is a low C. The nerfs to its armor also made it a bit more vulnerable to missile play nowadays. You're not going to see the Arachnarok very often, but when you do, it can still be a force to be reckoned with in certain Death Ball builds, especially around Black Orcs. That old school synergy of Black Orcs and Spiders still very much holds true, and they can do some good work there. Finally, we do have the Rogue Idol, and this is a unit that, well, I don't have much good to say about. I don't think it's as terrible as people make it out to be, but I think if you're going to bring a centerpiece unit like this, you would rather bring a big gun. So I'm actually going to give this guy an F tier, just because it's not as terrible as people say. It does have a lot of HP, it does hit pretty hard, it does have that crumbling bombardment when it loses every 25% of its HP, and it does hit harder over the course of the game. But ultimately, if you're going to bring a Rogue Idol, you are going to bring the big gun instead, because the big gun forces your opponent to you. The big gun forces your opponent to make some moves they don't want to be making. So for me, an unfortunate F tier here for the Rogue Idol. Which does move us on to the Regiments of Renown. We do have the Swamp Things, definitely better than Swamp Trolls because they do actually have Terror and they do have Poison, which is a double whammy of decent utility. A fairly pricey Regiment around Monstrous Infantry that doesn't hit very hard for the cost, but They have their niche uses. The fact that they cause terror, the fact that they apply poison means you can occasionally find a space for them. And I think and of course 50 leadership on a troll unit isn't bad. So they get a C, a low C here. Still not a unit I'd prioritize, but much better than their vanilla variant. The Ragnarok Spider Queen, she is pretty solid still. Definitely overshadowed nowadays. Not the domineering presence you used to see, but still a very, very prominent character or unit you'd see. She does, of course, have her Spiderling summons. She's got excellent combat stats and is just a general beefcake. So easy B tier for her. You still will see her fairly often, even if she's not sort of the preeminent choice she once was. Maybe I'm moving her down here towards the bottom of B is more fair, but she's still a fairly common sight on the battlefield. The Big Gun, another niche pick. I don't think there's too many matchups where he can shine, but you do occasionally see him versus, say, Dwarves, or you see him lobbing some boulders versus Vampire Counts and the like. Can dish out some major hurt. Once again, strong centerpiece with lots of armor, lots of HP. Can just be an absolute menace to bring down. And if you're going to bring that sort of centerpiece, this is the guy to bring over the Rogue Idol. He only costs a couple hundred more gold, and the advantages he gets in leadership, in combat prowess, and just being able to throw a rock makes him very, very solid. And that brings us to artillery. And Greenskin artillery, while perhaps not looking it, is in fact a solid lineup. Rock lobbers, not a terrible unit, I think. Once again, everything that's anti-infantry gets overshadowed by fanatics at the moment, but rock lobbers are all right, I would say. I'd rate them a solid mid-C here. And the Hammer of Gork, their Regiment of Renown, could probably bump itself up to about a B. You actually see it fairly often. It's good against Chosen. It's good for nuking down blobs of more elite troops. And nowadays, the debuff it applies doesn't friendly fire. So if you're firing into a blob of your troops, for example, you can hit essentially an enemy infantry unit with an enfeebling foe while, say, Black Orcs are wailing on it. And that does a lot of hurt. That can really debuff and swing an entire melee fight. The final artillery piece is Doom Divers, and I think Doom Divers are excellent, though not as busted as they were at one point. They got more expensive over the time. But homing missiles, AP, makes them a decent anti-air unit, makes them decent at counter battery on occasion, and makes them pretty good at hitting moving targets. Just a generally solid artillery piece, and gets an easy B tier. And that gets us Greenskins in a nutshell. A very evened out lineup. It's kind of the average, seems to be a C tier, and that's kind of what you'd expect. I think Greenskins at the moment have a bit of a reputation founded on their OP units, and I think Greenskins do have some units that are simply overtuned. Fanatics as a whole are just overpowered for what they do. Grom, Black Orc Big Boss, or not Black Orc Big Boss, but Grom, maybe the Hag still, Fungal Shrooms, and Boar Boys and Boar Boy Big Guns are all kind of overpowered for their price. Those are all units that are insanely well priced, and much of the Greenskin roster is rather well priced, which ends up synergizing stupidly well when the one downside, leadership, is being negated almost entirely, if not entirely, by Grom. That said, the Greenskins do still have some major stinkers. Not all of these units here are simply overshadowed by OP fanatics. Units like Squigs are simply not that appealing. Several variants of these chariots just have never been good. Units like Swamp or River Trolls are just not that good of a unit. Neither are Savage Orc Boar Boys. They're just not that great compared to normal Boar Boys, and they never were. So some of these units here just are kind of giants, of course, always a bit of a niche unit. So I think it is worth keeping in mind that the Greenskin roster, while certainly having those overpowered monstrosities, also just has some that overshadow a good chunk of it. Also has some units that are simply not very good and probably do need some love in the future. But that is it there. As always, guys, let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.